Welcome again to our Monopoly lecture in Business Administration 602. So in our last lecture we introduced perfect competition, where we had the market model and then the individual firm models grafted onto that market model. And in that example we had a representative firm which would have looked like all the other firms in the market. So we could use changes in cost at the firm level, or changes in demand, or at the market level. We could also do cost changes at the market level as well, to illustrate what happens to that market in equilibrium and how price and quantity changes. And again, I focused here on the assumptions driving that market model, and described that perfectly competitive market model as the key element to the fundamental market in economics. Not because it's most common, although it is a reasonably common market, but rather because it is the example by which we would measure the benefit to society of the other market. So that's the benchmarking model that we talk about. The competitive spectrum ranges from one end of perfect competition to a pure monopoly at the other end. And again, we have workable competition, which is really used by industrial economists to describe a near competitive market that doesn't meet all the same assumptions as for example, the commodity markets, which are the farm commodity type markets, which are the best example of perfect competition. And then we might get into a market model of a monopolistic competition, which would be brand name differences, and then oligopoly, a few number of firms. At that point, we really start talking about models where firms are taking each other into account. Before that, they're not. They're price setting, or they're pricing in a way that's really focused on their own profitability and not on the profitability of others. So once we start moving into markets where we care about other firms' behaviors, then we have different outcomes. And then we slide towards a duopoly, which are two firms, and monopoly. And the monopoly that we're really talking about here is a single firm that is providing a single product. There is good information about that product, but there are barriers to entry so that other firms cannot enter. And that's really the operative difference between the monopoly market and the perfectly competitive market, is the capacity for firms to enter that market. We care about firm exit as well. In a more sophisticated discussion, we could talk about the role that firm exit plays. If you can't exit because of big fixed costs that you have to pay off that are unique to that particular production, then you're not. You may continue to behave in a monopolistic fashion, even if entrance is available. But bottom line is, market entrance is really the capacity to constrain a market. So either geographic restrictions, or more commonly, you own a patent in the short run that precludes anybody else from having that market, or you are, again, geographic constraints or near monopoly that are a very common feature of healthcare markets, for example, or very commonly exhibit this sort of condition. But the assumptions of perfect competition and the assumptions of monopoly are relatively similar, except for that capacity to enter markets, and that limits the number of sellers to one. And so when we describe monopoly, we're talking about just a single market here. So when I draw it, we can draw a fairly straightforward example here: quantity and price. And so we'll start with a demand curve, and we'll just draw the demand curve downward sloping like this. And in my Econ 509 class, I usually go through deriving the marginal revenue curve, but we worked on statistics enough that I'm not going to do that. The demand curve is a linear function where price is equal to an intercept here, a negative slope times quantity. So that's our demand function. Marginal revenue is going to be price times quantity, so it's going to be, instead of P is equal to, let's say, A minus MQ, Q, which is this negative slope. If we multiply both sides by Q, so P times Q is equal to, at this point, then Q minus MQ squared, right, which is the revenue function. And then we take the first derivative of it. The first derivative in calculus gives us the rate of change. Then the intercept would drop out, and we would have a negative 2 MQ, which is essentially a marginal revenue function that has twice the steep of a slope as the demand curve in a linear model. So that's how we'll simply draw a marginal revenue function. And it can go into the zero range because, as I illustrated in the last lecture, you can actually have a marginal revenue that's negative. We'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the demand side of a monopolist market. Here's the monopoly. Obviously Latin for single firm in this market. And we're going to add to this the same average variable cost curve that the firm has regardless of market structure, right? The cost structure is really dependent upon the technology, the cost of inputs, not the market structure, whether or not it's perfectly competitive or monopolistically competitive or an oligopoly. And we're going to draw just the marginal cost curve here just because this tends to become a busy function. Now remember that in any market model, the firm is going to profit maximize by setting its marginal revenue equal to its marginal cost. In this instance then, and I'll change color here just for some clarity, the quantity, and that sets their quantity. The quantity is going to be equal to marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But they will price at the demand curve, of course, because the demand curve describes the price that consumers would be willing to pay for that number of products. So the price that the monopolist charges is going to be higher than the minimum of the average total cost curve, which would be where the price for perfect competition would be. It would be right here, right? That's what we've established in our previous model. And so the question here is, what happens in this market and where do we get profit? Now, I didn't talk about profit in the competitive market because I wanted to illustrate it here in perfect competition. This is the profit level. Boy, my drawing is really off today. So this is the profit because the cost at this profit maximizing level is at that point of the average variable cost curve that the firm set their quantity at. So again, marginal revenue equals marginal cost sets the quantity here that the monopolist will charge. We'll call that Q bar for the monopoly price or quantity, and P bar for the monopoly price. And so the cost per unit is at this level when we get to this level of production. So that's the cost. This is the price that it's selling for. So this square area are the profits that are earned by the monopolist. Now, in perfectly competitive markets, we don't have profit. We have what we call a normal profit, which is profit is, again, by our definition, the payment to entrepreneurs, and firms don't have that available to them in competition. There is no what we would call economic profit in perfectly competitive markets. There's just enough profit to keep firms in the market, and if profit gets too low, some exit. If it gets too high, some enter, right? If it gets above that normal profit. And that's a theoretical definition, not an accounting definition, right? In accounting, there's a very specific definition of profit. In economics, profit is the amount of total revenue that goes to the entrepreneur per unit of production that's sufficient to keep them in that market. And if it drops too low, they exit. So the definition is if entrepreneurs exit the market, the profit is too low. If there's entrance, it's too high. So the process of market equilibrium and perfect competition eliminates the presence of profit. However, in monopolists, there are profits. And the difference here between monopoly profits and perfectly competitive profits are that the existence of a profit in a monopoly would normally, if it were a competitive market, introduce entrance into this market. But there is not entrance available because of barriers to entry. Either the firm has a exclusive license or it has a patent protection on the product that it offers, so that a firm in perfect competition can always freely enter and exit. A monopolist does not have that risk of another firm entering that market behind them. And so they can sustain profits because nobody can enter the market. And the absence of barriers to entry are what causes there to be monopoly, the availability of monopoly profits. So this market condition normally has no natural capacity to exist. There has to be some barrier to entry. It could be entirely artificial. It could be a government patent, for example, that gives a company 17 years to produce what it wants, and no one else can produce that product without release from the monopolist, which normally would include a very big, premium to have a license to produce the product. It could enforce barriers to entry by buying up all the surrounding available products. It could, for example, there could be if there was a product being sold and you were able to convince all the people who were selling it to sell it to you as an intermediate good, then you could sell the products directly. So if you could, for example, capture the entire diamond market, you would have a monopoly in that. There are very, very few examples of that sort of market where you could buy all the suppliers, because if you're charging monopoly profits, the incentive to enter is so robust. There are things that a firm might be able to do that would give it monopoly type profits that are now illegal under what the United States calls antitrust laws, and in Europe and the EU call them competition laws. And so requiring buyers to buy a bundled product like a washer and dryer together are illegal under the Clayton Act of 1913. For two firms conspiring on price or geographic market as a violation of the Sherman Act of 1890, which was the first of the competition laws. And so those types of government prescription of activities is designed to prevent monopolists taking over a particular market. Another example, which is commonly used, is the Standard Oil example from a 1911 antitrust case, where Standard Oil, the Rockefeller family fortune, would buy they were a large company, so they would move into market, buy out all the other oil suppliers, and then become the regional monopolist. Then they would have enough revenue to go to the next place and buy out all the other firms. And if a firm really wouldn't have a choice not to sell, because it was they would have to be a publicly traded firm to be big enough to engage in this market. And this is there are also examples of this occurring in healthcare markets today. So the process of a hospital chain, for example, moving into a market and then doing what Standard Oil did, which is called vertical foreclosure. You buy all the suppliers. They may then purchase all of the physicians' offices and ensure that their no one else is able to admit patients. That's called vertical foreclosure. You control the stream from upstream into your hospital, and you ensure that the only people who can refer patients to your hospital are your employees, and that none of them will refer to another hospital. So you create what's called vertical foreclosure, which is what the Standard Oil market did. And so the monopoly behavior that occurs in during the Gilded Age is occurring certainly now in hospital markets. There's some argument that it is occurring also in social media and technology companies. Generally, there's a distinction between behavior that's permanent, right? So that it would be having a fixed barrier to entry like what you see in hospitals, or that's temporary, granted by government, so like a patent. So we like to see patents because they tend to allow technology to be shared while giving the investor, the person who, the firm, the individual who discovered the item, an opportunity to produce enough revenue to justify that investment. And so this monopoly market is very simple. It involves a demand side, which is a demand curve, and a marginal revenue curve. And then it has a cost side, which is marginal cost and average cost. And it then firms will set marginal revenue equals to marginal cost to determine the quantity of output. They will price at their demand curve, which is really what the demand curve is that combination of price and quantity that consumers are willing to pay. And then the cost of per unit cost will be at the average variable cost curve, the average total cost curve. I made a mistake here. This is the average total cost here. Glad I'm going over the average total cost, not average variable cost. And that describes the cost of production at that point. We could include the average variable cost, right? It falls beneath the average total cost, but monopolists don't really have operative concerns over the average variable cost because they don't have price fluctuations. When we talk a little bit more about and if you read the textbook about the perfectly competitive market model, you'll see that price could drop beneath the average total cost curve, and that causes firms to exit the market. And so there are times when you could be losing money in production. Monopolists would not have that problem. So let's just go through that again. Monopolist is going to be facing a downward sloping demand curve and a marginal revenue curve that has twice the steepness of the demand curve. They're going to set marginal revenue equals marginal cost, just like the perfectly competitive firm that will set their quantity of production. Here it's Q bar. They will price at the demand curve, which is P bar, and the difference between the price and the cost per unit, which is the gap between the demand curve and the average total cost curve, that rectangle are their monopoly profits. And again, why economists don't like monopolists, or we generally regard monopolists as an unwelcome feature of markets, is because this monopoly profits transfers value or dollars from consumers to producers, who then restrict trade and production. So in a perfectly competitive market, you wouldn't have unemployment, you wouldn't have unused resources. In a monopoly market, you do. And so when we talk later on in economics, and we won't do it in this class, about welfare analysis or how economists measure the positive goodness or badness of markets. So we're measuring whether or not markets achieve some societal goals, such as maximizing employment. We would say monopolies fail to achieve that, while perfectly competitive markets tend to achieve that. So that is why economists prefer competitive markets in terms of achieving those social goals. And with that, we'll stop recording, and our next lecture will combine these briefly and talk about macroeconomics. Thank you.